Hello everyone, this is Spencer Campbell of Gila RPGs, and in this video I'm going to show you how combat works in Loot, my upcoming TTRPG that's inspired by looter shooters. It's a little bit of fantasy, a little bit of looter shooter, all in one game. Loot goes back and forth between exploration and combat, and the whole game is diceless, so you might be wondering, how does combat work if there's no dice, if we're not rolling to hit? So what I've gone ahead and done here is I've put together a pretty simple fight that might take place in one of your adventures to give you a sense of what a combat in Loot looks like. Keep in mind that all of this stuff that you're seeing right now is incomplete or not final versions of things. I'm sort of representing my virtual tabletop here with this 6x6 grid and these simple icons that I've pulled off of the Noun project. And I have these sort of rudimentary Loot character sheets that represent what our characters might look like. I want to talk about those first before we talk about the fight so that we understand what our characters might be able to do when the fighting breaks out. A character in Loot is entirely defined by their loot, things that they're carrying. As you can see, these characters have some pieces of loot already attached to them. They have a couple of weapons, they have a piece of clothing and a magic item, but they also have empty slots, meaning these aren't full characters yet. They have to go out and get more stuff. So this character, this wizard here, could carry more magic items eventually and some consumables. Same thing with our knight. They have a couple of weapons, a piece of armor, and a magic item, but they're also waiting to collect more loot, more magic items and consumables as well. You'll notice also that the two characters have different stats. They have different amounts of health and different amounts of armor, and the approaches here on the right side. The approaches are the way that you accomplish challenges and obstacles, usually in exploration, but sometimes they're relevant in combat too. The reason they're different from each other is entirely defined by the loot. All characters have a starting set of stats, and then that is sort of enforced or enhanced with the loot that they're carrying. So you can see that this wizard here has a couple of pieces of item that have increased their health a little bit. They get a little bit of health here from this pact bound hide, which allows them to spend some focus and regain health, but it doesn't give them a lot of health to start. So they grabbed a giant's ring to get a little bit more health and a little bit more force. So the wizard has a lot of approaches to spend, but they don't have a lot of health, and they only have 1 point of armor to help defend themselves during the fight. The knight kind of took a different approach, as you might imagine. They took some iron plates, so they have a lot more health going on here, and they have more armor from their shield and that iron plate. So they're a lot more defensive, but you'll notice that they don't have as many of those approaches as a result, meaning they're going to be really strong for us in combat, but outside of combat, they're going to maybe rely on that wizard to take care of some of the challenges they run into. In general, these characters are not set in stone. They're going to be swapping out things throughout every single adventure that they're going in, meaning no character is ever set into a certain archetype or a certain playstyle. You can change and swap things out as you get new loot. So how does this work in terms of combat? Well, let's look at our board here. I've sort of set up an ambush of sorts. We have our knight and our wizard here, and they're kind of going through a forest, and they are ambushed by a goblin boss who's sort of represented by this orangish yellow orc, and then I've got these 4 green goblins that are running around trying to ambush from all sides. When combat takes place in Loot, it always happens on a 6x6 grid like this, and then it's filled with any kind of terrain that makes sense, the starting positions you put together, and then you dive right into it. Loot combat takes place in sort of rounds and turns, so at the start of the round, the players always get to go first, the adventurers go first, and they can choose whoever wants to go first. After a player goes, an enemy goes, and then a player goes, and an enemy goes, and we'll keep doing that until all of the PCs, all of the adventurers have taken a turn. Once they have, one last enemy goes, and we start a new round. We care about rounds and turns because some combat items, some magic items and weapons and things like that might have effects depending on rounds and turns. So that's why we have sort of this somewhat set schedule for how the fighting goes, but it's fluid in that the adventurers can kind of choose round by round who's going to go first, who's going to go second, so you can adapt to the needs of the fight. The one thing that the GM has to keep in mind is that when they're activating an enemy, they have to activate somebody that hasn't been used this round if they can. Meaning, I can't just keep using this goblin boss, even though they're more powerful than all the goblins, because that wouldn't be very fair. I need to let the other goblins have a chance as well. So we're going to just jump into this fight. And as I said, at the start of every fight, the adventurers get to go first. Now, looking at our characters, let's kind of consider what they can do in a fight. I'm going to start with the knight down here. They've got a simple sword and a shield, a sword and board combo here. You'll notice that a lot of weapons have something called a basic action and then a charged action. Basic actions are things that characters can do over and over again without ever having to worry about it working or not working. Meaning, this knight can always do one harm to anybody that's at range 1. What does range 1 mean in loot? Well, all range in distance is measured orthogonally, meaning up, down, left, and right. A diagonal space is considered 2 spaces away, because you'd have to go 1 to the left and 1 down to get to this space, for example. So right now, the closest goblins to me as the knight are 2 spaces away. There's 1, and then there's 2, or 1 and 2. I also have a charged action on a lot of these weapons as well. A charged action is more like a more powerful or cooler version of that weapon. And you can't do that over and over again. When you use the charged effect of a weapon, you sort of turn it sideways, draining it to show that that weapon has been used, and you can't do the charged action again until you recover. Recovering is an action that you can take during combat. It lets you reset all of your drained cards, but that takes up some of your turn, so you have to be careful about deciding when you're going to recover. It also means you have to kind of think about when are you going to use those charged actions. They're powerful, but you can't do them over and over again. So when is the right strategic time to do it? When a weapon is drained like this, you can use the basic action though. So I can still use this sword as a good old reliable one range, one harm weapon, but every once in a while I might decide to use that charge action and get that extra point of harm. Now that's a simple sword. These are beginner characters, so the charge action isn't super exciting or new. As you get cooler and cooler loot, you'll realize that those charge actions are going to give you lots of things that you can do. I've got a shield here. It's giving me a little bit of armor, but I do have sort of a shield bash ability where I can bonk an enemy that's at range 1 and they take 1 fewer action during their turn. So I can sort of stun an enemy if I need to. My plate isn't really giving me anything for combat action, so it's just giving me health and armor, so it's keeping me alive. But I do have this thing, the Mercurial Ring. During the first round of combat, which is what we're in right now, I get to take an extra turn. So I get to just go all over again compared to everybody else. I can take that turn right away after my current turn, or I might let my wizard friend go and then I'll go again before the next round kicks in. What is my wizard friend able to do? Well, the wizard has a spell, obviously, because they're a wizard. They have the flame aura. Notice that this doesn't have a basic action. Some weapons are just charged actions, meaning they're really powerful, but they're not meant to be done over and over again. Spells are typically like this. So this deals 1 harm to all characters within range, and the range of this spell is 1 to 2. So now I'm blasting and burning everybody within my area. Right now, it's probably not a good idea to use. I'd be cooking my good friend the knight and none of the goblins, but I have that option. I also do have a spear, just in case I need to get up close and personal with the goblins. It has a little bit better range than the sword, and it also has a charge action that gives me more mobility. I can move and hit somebody really hard with this spear. This isn't a beginner weapon, but I gave it to the wizard just so that they have a little bit more power. Like we said earlier, the Pact Bound Hide does allow me to heal. I can use this as a charge action to spend one of my focus, which I've got 4 of, to get some health back. So if this fight starts to turn against me, I can recover. My Giant's Ring isn't doing anything for me in terms of actions in combat. It's just making me a little bit more powerful in terms of my stats. So let's dive into this. I think the knight is going to pretty obviously go for the goblin boss, right? That's what the knight, the sword and board, is going to do when they see an enemy like that. So what is a character able to do on their turn? Well, adventurers can do 2 actions, and those actions include moving 1 space, unless you have an item that lets you do more than that, using any of your loot, so using the basic action, the charge action, or anything like that of your loot you have, recovering, which allows you to sort of take back or reset any of those cards that you have sort of tapped or drained, and then maneuver, which allows you to sort of do something that isn't covered by your cards. This is you sort of finding a way to narratively influence the fight, maybe grappling an enemy or climbing up a wall or something like that, allowing you to spend your approaches through the core mechanic that we see in the game in a way in combat that doesn't line up with our cards. But the knight's not thinking about anything like that. They want to go beat up that goblin boss. So the knight's going to use one of their actions to move closer to the goblin boss. That's one of my 2 actions. For my second action, I'm going to hit this goblin boss, right? And why wait? I might as well use the charged action for this simple sword. It's range 1, which the goblin boss currently is, and I do 2 harm to that boss. So I'm going to tap this, and I'm going to do a big old swing against the goblin boss. Now I would look to the GM and see if the goblin boss is dead, and they're not. They're still alive right now, but at least I know I've taken a big chunk out of them. That's my turn so far. I can immediately take another turn if I want, and I think I'm going to, just because I'm going to try and keep like this goblin boss as low impact as possible. So what can I do on my second turn? Well, I can't do this 2 harm hit again until I decide to reset my sword or any of my items that I've drained. But I can bop him, or I could use the simple action of my sword. I'm going to bonk this goblin boss, so I'm going to also drain my shield here. I'm going to use that charged effect as well. Range 1, and this enemy takes 1 fewer action. So enemies normally take 2 actions on their turn, so now the goblin boss can only do 1 thing when it decides to go. I've brought them down quite a bit, and what the heck, I might as well use the basic action on my sword to take another chunk out of them, another 1 harm. I look to the GM and I see that the goblin boss still isn't dead. I did 3 harm to it, but it's still standing, so it's a more robust enemy. But I've at least taken them down a whole bunch, and they only get to take 1 action. Now the GM, which happens to be me right now, might realize, ooh, I should probably use this goblin boss before that wizard gets a chance to blow them up. So I, as the GM, would decide, okay, I'm going to use the goblin boss during this turn, and I would look to see what a goblin boss can do. Enemies in Loot don't work exactly the same way as the characters because they don't have cards. They don't have loot. Instead, they just have a list of actions that they can take, which are things that have ranges and harm or various effects. So they look a lot like the weapon cards or the magic item cards in terms of how they're written. They're just not a bunch of cards that the GM has to be turning and twisting and things like that. They just have a bunch of at-will abilities that they can use. So the GM is going to look at their list of actions that the goblin boss can do and think, okay, what am I going to do in this situation? How am I going to like hold back against these really like mean adventures that are hitting me so much? And the goblin boss has the ability to swing a big club. They can call in reinforcements, but only if they're not already outnumbering the PCs, and right now there's too many goblins. Or I could rally a goblin to take a turn right after me. That would normally be really good, but that would be my whole action, so it's not really doing me a lot. So I think I'm just going to swing my club as the goblin boss right back at the knight. The goblin club does 2 harm at range 1, and so the knight would normally take 2 harm. What do I do in this situation? Well, I look and see. I could take the harm if I wanted to. I've got 5 health. That would leave me with 3 health standing. Or I've got this armor here. I could spend some of my armor. Whenever you decide to spend armor in the game, you use it to mitigate the harm that is coming your way. So as the knight here, I've got a lot of armor from the plate that I have and the shield that I have and everything like that. And how armor works in this game is that you mitigate the amount of harm coming your way equal to your armor. So if I elect to use my armor, I'm mitigating 3 harm, which is exactly what I need. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And when I do that, it's going to take away all that harm coming my way. And after you use armor, you reduce the amount of armor you have by 1. So my knight now has 2 armor left to track for the rest of the fight. And that armor is going to, as you can see, get weaker and weaker. So I can only block less and less harm as the fight goes on. Let me change my little tabletop here. I do all my fights in Affinity Publisher, by the way, so if you're looking at this and wondering what is this virtual tabletop he's doing, I do it all like this. It's just how I've always done things. So I'm going to mark my armor here as kind of marked or spent, and then I've negated that harm that is coming my way. So the knight has survived the fight, or at least that round, and the fight continues. Now, the goblin boss would normally have 2 actions, but he got shield bonged, so he only gets 1. Now it's the player's turn again. The wizard's going to kind of look here and see what can he do. He's got the flame aura that burns everybody within 1 to 2 spaces, which can burn a lot of people depending on where I'm standing. I've also got a spear that I can use to just kind of like stab a goblin. I think I'm going to start by stabbing a goblin and maybe luring the rest of the goblins in our direction so that I can eventually burn them down. So what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to actually try and go for this goblin that's all the way over here. Now, normally I can only move one space and then use an action, or I have to use my second action to move again to get in range. But the spear has a range of 2, so I'm going to just move one, use the basic action of my spear as my second thing, and stab at that goblin. I do only 1 harm, but I looked at the GM, and the GM says, yeah, that's good enough. This goblin, oops, this goblin is dead. And so they get knocked out, and I've killed a goblin, which is great news for me. That's my 2 actions. I didn't have to use the charged effect for my spear, so I'm holding on to that for the future. And now the goblins take a turn. So one of these goblins is in fact going to get closer. I can't use the boss because he's already been used this round. So here comes this goblin. He moves a little closer. He moves 1. And as the GM, I look to see what other actions he have. And one of the actions the goblins have is to throw a rock at somebody that's 2 spaces away. Well, this wizard's 2 spaces away, so this goblin's going to throw a rock at him. It deals 1 harm, and the wizard looks at his stuff and he goes, ooh, 1 harm is actually a quarter of my life. I don't think I want to take that. So he's also going to spend the use of his armor here. I don't have any more armor now as my wizard. Any more harm I take is going to my health. And that's going to be scary for me because I need to find ways to not get hurt, because you can see that some of these characters can be quite vulnerable. They can be sort of glass cannons, and I'm going to have to recover during the fight or after the fight any kind of damage that I take. Okay, so both of the adventurers have gone. The knight had his double turn, and that means that's the end of the round. All the enemies are back, fair for me to use as the GM, but it's the players who get to go now. So the players are going to look and see who should go first. They look to one another and they nod knowingly to the knight and say, go for it. Try and take out that boss. Now the knight looks at their stuff and realizes, ooh, I've kind of used up my stuff right now. I could use these back. So they're going to use one of their actions to do the recover action. That basically resets these cards back to their normal orientation. And now I have access to them. When you take the recover action, you also heal 1, but the knight hasn't taken any damage, so he's okay. He looks at his stuff and he says, you know what? I'm going to swing the sword again real big, and goes in for another one of these charged attacks. I deal 2 harm to the goblin boss. I look to the GM, and the GM frowns, seeing that the goblin boss has been slain. It seems like we've done enough harm to it eventually to kill it. That is my knight's turn. That's the 2 actions. I've recovered and swung the sword, and now I am done. The goblins get to take a turn now. This goblin is going to move forward, seeing the vulnerable wizard here. They're sort of sensing weakness. It hurls another rock at the wizard, and the wizard doesn't really have much that they can do right now. They don't have any armor to resist it, so they just take the 1 harm to their health. They're a quarter of the way dead. They're maybe starting to get a little nervous. It is now the wizard's turn, and they're contemplating and considering their options. And I think they're going to go nuclear. I think they're going to just blow up as many things as they can with their flame aura. They're going to move the 1 space here just to kind of put some distance from the knight, even though the knight's still in range. And they're going to activate the flame aura, which range 1 to 2. So everything that's immediately next to me, but also all of these spaces that are 2 away as well. So it's a big burst of 1 harm to all enemies in that space. So I go erupting out in flame as a wizard here. And that means the 2 goblins are each going to take the 1 point of harm, and we've already established that's enough to take them out. So, ooh, I took out 2 goblins with that attack. But I look to my friend the knight and say, I'm sorry, you're in range, and you're going to take 1 harm. The knight looks at their stuff and goes, you know what, I'll shrug it off with the armor. And block that and not take that damage because they want to hold on to their health for a future time. Now, as a GM, I would also kind of think about, does this affect the terrain? I mean, these are a bunch of trees and I just exploded with fire. Mechanically, it doesn't say that I destroy terrain along with this, but I think as a GM, it would be more fun if I literally just singed these trees away. So the battlefield just suddenly opened up a whole bunch here. That is the end of my turn as the wizard, and now this goblin's going to move forward, and seeing that its friends just got nuked by this wizard, it's also going to throw a rock at the wizard and do another point of harm. I've already lost half my health as the wizard, but I have had a pretty big impact, which is nice. We're sort of reaching our last round here, as you might imagine. We start the round anew, and the adventurers can go in whatever order they want. The knight looks at the wizard, and the wizard look at the knight, and they say, after you, and the knight is allowed to go forward. They take their one action to move closer. There's no need to recover this. They've already sort of figured out that these goblins have 1 health, so they use the basic action of their sword to take out this last goblin, and that's the end of the fight. The adventurers have survived the ambush. The knight is really kind of looking okay. They use their armor to protect themselves. The wizard has taken some damage, but they also did a lot of impact with their spells. Hopefully this gives you a sense about how combat in Loot works. It is punchy, it's quick, it's tactical, it's about resource management. How do you manage the resources of the basic and charged actions of your weapons and magic items? When do you use armor? When do you take those hits to health? And it's very much about positioning as well, right? How do you maneuver around this 6x6 grid to get the most effect out of your things? This was a relatively simple scenario with relatively easy enemies, but these are also some beginner adventurers. You can imagine what the future fights might look like as we get cooler and more powerful weapons, but then start to run into the more dangerous weapons that are out there in Loot. Thank you so much for watching this video. If this seemed interesting to you, Loot is currently on Kickstarter. You can find the link in the description below. If you're watching this after the Kickstarter, then the link is somewhere for you to find the final version of the game. I'll talk to you later. Bye.